He filed 17 complaints against my bookstore in 11 months, and I never once raised my voice at him. Not when the first inspector showed up on a Wednesday morning with a clipboard and a city parking pass swinging from his rearview mirror. Not when the second one came, and the third. Not when the certified letter arrived telling me my operating permit had been suspended pending a review that could take however long it wanted to take. I stood in the middle of Birch and Story on a Tuesday afternoon in March with that letter in my hand, and the afternoon sun coming through the front windows the way it always did at that hour, turning the wood floors the color of honey. And I thought about my father. I thought about how he used to say that the people who yell loudest in an argument are almost always the ones who know they're wrong. 14 months after that letter, my neighbor's commercial property went to auction for unpaid taxes. I sat in the third row with a bidder's paddle and a cashier's check, and I was the calmest person in the room. My father opened Birch and Story in 1999 in a narrow 2-story building on the corner of Hazel Street in Carteret, North Carolina. He was 31 years old, and he had $11,000 saved from 7 years of teaching high school English, a second-hand shelving system he'd hauled home from a hardware store going out of business, and an opinion about every children's book ever written. He painted the mural himself, back when the building still had peeling drywall and a water stain on the ceiling that looked almost exactly like the state of Florida. Florida sailing forest scene, birch trees with white bark and gold leaves, and tucked between the trunks, animals reading books. A fox with reading glasses perched at the end of his nose. A rabbit with a thick novel propped open on its knees. A small brown bear in the lower corner who my father always said wasn't reading, just thinking. Thinking is the other half of it. He'd tell the kids who came for story time, and they'd nod very seriously, the way children do when they suspect an adult is telling them something important. 22 years. That's how long he kept that store. He built it from a 2-shelf operation with a cash register that jammed every third transaction into a business with 8 employees, a waiting list for birthday party packages, and a Saturday morning story time that packed the floor from the picture book table all the way back to the young adult section. I grew up in that store. I did my homework between the shelves after school. I learned to read sitting in the exact chair where other people's children later learned to read. When my father died of a heart attack in the spring of my 28th year, I didn't need to think about what came next. I picked up his keys and drove to the store. That was 6 years before my neighbor arrived. He came with a construction crew first, which I noticed but didn't think much about. The vacant lot next to Birch and Story had changed hands a few times over the years, and I'd gotten used to permits being filed and then going quiet. But this time someone meant business. Within 3 weeks, the old cinderblock structure that had been a printing company in the 80s was half demolished. A month after that, a sign went up. Harlow Ridge Residential. Luxury condominiums. Coming soon. He came to my back door on a Thursday morning in October before I'd flipped the sign to open. I'd seen him once across the lot. A man in his early 50s wearing a barn coat that cost more than my monthly utility bill, and I hadn't thought anything of him. He introduced himself, said he was the developer behind the Harlow Ridge project, and that he hoped we could talk. He was pleasant. He said the right things in the right order. He told me the neighborhood was changing, that property values were rising, that the footprint he had in mind for the full development was slightly larger than what the vacant lot alone could accommodate. Then he slid a piece of paper across my work table with a number on it. $180,000. My father spent 32 years in that building, the last 22 as the owner. He put in new plumbing in 2008, new electrical in 2011 after an inspector flagged the old panel, a new roof in 2014, a full interior renovation in 2017 with lighting he'd researched for 3 months, because he wanted it warm enough that children wouldn't feel like they were standing in a fluorescent-lit school hallway. The building alone was worth more than what he was offering me. The business wasn't even in the calculation. I told him no, I was polite about it, but no. He nodded, folded the paper back into his jacket pocket, thanked me for my time, and left. I watched him walk across the lot and thought that was the end of it. The first complaint arrived 14 days later. Noise ordinance. My HVAC condenser unit, which sat on a concrete pad on the side of the building, was allegedly exceeding the city's permitted decibel limit for a commercial zone. A city inspector came, measured it, found it within range, and left. That cost me half a workday and $80 in rescheduled staff hours. The second complaint came the following month. Signage violation, my sidewalk chalkboard sign, which I'd been putting out every morning for 6 years without a single issue, was allegedly obstructing the pedestrian right-of-way by 4 inches. I measured it. It was not. Another inspector, another wasted morning, another form to fill out. The third was a fire inspection triggered by an anonymous tip about improper storage of combustible materials. I sell children's books, not fuel. The inspector walked through, made a note about 1 box of donated materials sitting too close to an electrical panel. A box that had been there for 3 days and was scheduled for pickup that Friday. And closed the case. By the time the 7th complaint arrived, I knew it wasn't going to stop. By the 11th, I'd started keeping a folder. By the 17th, the city had a case file on Birchin's story thick enough to fill a small binder, even though every single inspection had either found nothing or found a technical issue. So minor it was corrected on-site the same day. The complaint that finally did the damage was about our Saturday story time. Twice a month I hosted a public reading event. Parents, grandparents, kids, sometimes 40 or 50 people, crowded into a cozy space with their shoes off and their socks on the rug. Someone filed an allegation that I was operating as a venue for public assemblies without the appropriate fire safety certification for gatherings exceeding 25 people. The certification existed. The city had issued it. But there was a technicality in the renewal window. The certification had lapsed by 18 days while I was deep in managing my father's estate, and I had assumed it had auto-renewed because no one had ever told me it hadn't. No one had said a single word about it in 6 years of twice-monthly story times. Until my neighbor's attorney sent a 4-page letter to the city zoning office with the lapsed certificate date highlighted in yellow. The city suspended my operating permit pending review. They estimated the process would take 6 to 9 months. It took 9. I sat with the letter for 3 days before I made any decisions. My father used to say that the first thing you think when you're angry is almost never the right thing. The second thing is usually better. But the third thing, the one that comes after you've slept and eaten something and let the initial heat die down, that's the one worth saying out loud. So I waited for the third thing. And when it came, it wasn't rage. It was something quieter and more useful. It was a plan. On the 4th day, I called my 8 employees in. Kofi had been with the store for 12 years. He'd started as a part-time shelver when he was 19, all lanky arms and encyclopedic knowledge of middle-grade fantasy series, and had worked his way into managing our events and school outreach program. He knew every regular customer by name, including the children, and most of the children's dogs. When I said the words out loud, that the store was closing temporarily, that I was going to have to let people go, that I didn't know exactly how long it would be, he looked at the floor for a moment, the way you do when something lands hard, and then he looked back up at me and said, "Okay, Fern, what do you need from me today?" That was just who he was. Even in the moment it hit him, his first instinct was to ask how he could help. I sent everyone home early, and I sat alone in the store for 2 hours, and I didn't cry until I was in my car with the doors closed. I locked the front door of Birchin's Story for the first time in 6 years on a Wednesday at noon. I stood on the sidewalk holding the key, and I looked at my father's mural through the front glass. The fox with the reading glasses, the rabbit with the novel, the small bear just thinking, and I made myself a promise. Don't react, don't retaliate, don't give him the satisfaction of watching you fall apart in a way he can see. Then I went home and I got to work. I want to be honest about the 14 months that followed, because they were not a clean story. They were not a straight line from losing the store to building something better. There were months when I didn't know if I was going to make it at all, and one month in particular, the 9th month, that came as close as anything in my adult life to breaking me. The property tax bill came due on the building, and I had to decide whether to take out a second mortgage or sell. Selling meant admitting the whole thing was over. It meant my neighbor would get what he'd come for. Eventually, even if it was the bank that handed it to him instead of me. I thought about that for 4 days. Then I called my accountant. Bertie had done my father's books for 15 years. She is a small woman with a very calm voice who has a way of going quiet when she's doing math in her head that used to unnerve me, until I understood it meant she was actually solving the problem. She went quiet for a long time when I laid out the numbers. Then she said, "All right, let's make this work." We took the second mortgage. I have never spent a dollar I was less certain about and more grateful for. What I did instead of running a storefront was build something without a storefront to attack. I had spent years accumulating relationships, estate sale companies, used bookshops in 3 states, library deaccession programs, a network of people who dealt in out-of-print and rare children's titles. I called in every favor I'd ever been owed, and I started sourcing and reselling under a new name. Lacey Books, my father's last name, no public-facing anything, no sign, no permit, no chalkboard on the sidewalk for anyone to measure with a ruler. The first month I made less than I spent. The second month was the same. By the 4th month, I had a small but loyal mailing list of collectors and parents who'd found me through word of mouth, and an inquiry came in from a school district librarian in Wilmington, who was trying to build a more diverse early reader collection and couldn't find what she needed through her standard distributors. I said yes before I'd confirmed I could actually fill the order. Then I found the books. That was the turn. A year in, Lacey Books was supplying curated collections to 4 school library systems and 2 pediatric hospital waiting rooms across eastern North Carolina. I'd hired back 2 of my former employees, Kofi among them, who was working remotely managing the school outreach accounts and had somehow grown that side of the business to the point where it was nearly self-sustaining, because that's who Kofi is, the kind of person who builds things whether or not there's a building to put them in. I was not happy, though. I want to say that plainly, because I've told this story to a few people, and they always want it to be triumphant in a way that makes the hard part sound like it was secretly fine. It was not fine. I missed the store every day with a specific physical ache, the way you miss something that has another person's hands all over it. I missed the bell above the front door, a small brass thing on a curved spring my father had hung the first week he opened, that rang every time someone came in or went out. I missed the way the afternoon light made the floors look like honey. I missed the bear in the corner who was just thinking. 14 months after the permit suspension, Bertie called me on a Tuesday morning and said, "I think you need to see something." She had pulled the county tax records on the property next door. My neighbor's condo project, Harlow Ridge Luxury Condominiums coming soon, had stalled. The city had approved his initial permits, but the project then ran into a series of environmental impact reviews related to drainage and runoff from the site, the kind of bureaucratic friction that moves at its own pace and does not care what your timeline says. He had over-leveraged. A secondary lender had called in a portion of the debt. 3 years of commercial property taxes on the lot adjacent to my building were unpaid. The county had scheduled a tax lien auction. I sat with that for a week, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to be sure I was making the decision for the right reasons. I thought about what my father would have said. He would have said, if the numbers make sense and the space gives you something you actually need, then buy it. Don't let your feelings make the decision. But don't pretend you don't have feelings either. The numbers made sense, I needed the space, and yes, I had feelings. I registered for the auction under the business name, Lacey Books LLC, not my own name. Bertie's suggestion, so no one in that room would know who was holding paddle number 9 until after the gavel fell. The auction was held at the county clerk's office on a Thursday morning. Fluorescent lights, folding chairs arranged in crooked rows, a bailiff who looked like he had somewhere better to be. 6 registered bidders. 3 didn't show. 2 dropped out before the second round. It came down to me and one other bidder, a commercial investor from Raleigh with a printed property analysis and a practiced poker face. He dropped out at $68,000. I bid $70,000. The gavel came down faster than I expected. I sat still for a moment after it landed, not for drama, just because I needed a second to understand that it was real. I drove home with a copy of the sale receipt on the passenger seat and called Bertie. She said, "Good, now go tell him." I told her I wasn't planning to do that. She said, "Fern, go tell him, you'll feel better." She was right, as she almost always is. I went the following Saturday morning. I'd chosen that day deliberately because I knew his routine. He was an early riser, coffee on the porch by 9, the kind of man who mistakes a predictable schedule for control. I knocked on the door of the site trailer he'd been using as an office while the project was on hold. He opened it already knowing something had shifted. I could see it in the set of his jaw before I said a word. Small enough town, fast enough news. "You bought it," he said, not a question. I did. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are you going to do with it?" "Expand the bookstore," I said. "We've needed the space for years." Something moved across his face, the kind of recalculation that happens when someone has been running a story in their head about how things are supposed to go, and the actual world hands them a different ending. I offered you a fair number, he said. His voice had a quality I recognized. Not anger exactly, but the thing that lives just underneath anger when the anger has started to run out. You offered me $180,000 for a building my father put over $300,000 into. Plus 22 years of his life and 6 years of mine. There was nothing fair about that number. I think you knew it when you wrote it down. He started to respond, then stopped. His mouth closed. He looked out across the lot, the half-demolished structure, the stalled equipment, the Harlow Ridge sign still advertising luxury condominiums in lettering that was starting to fade at the edges. I have the right to challenge the sale, he said finally. You do, I said. Your attorney will tell you how tax auctions typically go in this state once the county records the transfer. I'd listen carefully to what they say. I told him he had 30 days before the transfer finalized. Then I left. I didn't wait to see his face change again. I'd said what I came to say, and I meant it without malice, which was important to me. The malice would have meant he still had something I needed. He didn't. His legal challenge lasted 3 weeks. Tax lien sales in North Carolina are notoriously difficult to unwind after the county records them, and his attorney apparently told him so directly, because the challenge was withdrawn without going to a full hearing. I heard secondhand from a contractor who had worked on both properties that my neighbor had relocated his remaining business interests to a development project in Mecklenburg County. Whether that went any better for him, I genuinely have no idea. I found as the months went on that I thought about him less and less, which is its own kind of answer. Birch & Story reopened on the first Saturday of June, 14 months after I'd locked the door. We knocked through the shared wall between the original building and the newly acquired space and gave the children's section what it had always needed and never had enough of: room. 2 additional rows for story time. A reading loft we built along the back wall with a rope ladder, 3 kinds of pillows, and enough space for 6 small children to pile in at once. We expanded the young adult section into what had been a dark storage alcove. We added a community board near the door where local schools could post reading lists, and where families could leave book recommendations in a small wooden box my father had built decades ago, and that I'd kept in back storage for 6 years because I could not bring myself to throw it away, even when I wasn't sure what I was keeping it for. Kofi came back full-time. On reopening day, he stood at the front door and greeted people as they came in, and I heard him tell a small girl who arrived with her grandmother that she had excellent timing because a new shipment of early readers had just come in, and he had set one aside specifically for her because he knew she'd been waiting for the sequel. He had done that from memory, from a list he kept in his head, from the kind of loyalty that doesn't require a building to exist in. I used part of the proceeds from selling a section of the acquired lot to a local architecture firm, at a fair market price, not a desperate one, to establish a small literacy fund in my father's name, administered through the county library system. It covers books for children in the county's after-school programs, the ones whose families can't always absorb the cost of a new paperback. It is not a large or complicated gesture. My father would have wanted it practical and quiet and useful, so that is what it is. The mural is still there. Fox with the reading glasses, rabbit with the novel, bear in the corner, just thinking. Last September, I painted a second panel on the newly opened wall, continued the forest, more birch trees, more animals tucked in between them with their noses in books, and I did it badly enough that I eventually hired an actual muralist to fix what I'd started. I did the undercoat. She did everything that mattered. I think my father would have found that arrangement very funny and very him. The bell above the door still works. Same bell he hung in the first week he opened. A small brass thing on a curved spring that rings every time someone comes in and every time someone goes out. I have replaced nearly everything else in that store at least twice over. That bell I have never touched. Some things hold up better when you leave them alone. My neighbor was willing to grind down 17 complaints because he believed the weight of the process would outlast my willingness to stand under it. That's the actual bet people like him make. Not that they're right, but that you'll exhaust first. What he didn't account for is what happens when someone has been raised in a building, when they know every creak in the floorboards and every angle of the afternoon light, when the thing you're defending isn't just a business license, but a bear painted on a wall by someone who loved you. You don't get tired of that. You get more certain. I keep the auction receipt in the top drawer of my desk, tucked inside the same manila folder where I saved every one of those 17 complaints. Not as a trophy, more like a record, evidence of how long a particular kind of patience has to hold before it becomes something else entirely. Some people will spend months trying to take what you've built. What they forget is that you were already there before they arrived. And you know how to wait.